It was a clear Tuesday afternoon when Officer James Keller spotted the silver sedan traveling down Maple Avenue. He followed the car for several blocks, his eyes narrowing as he watched the driver signal properly at each turn. When the car slowed at a yellow light, instead of rushing through, he decided it was time to make his move. Officer Keller flipped on his lights and siren. In his rearview mirror, Diane Washington saw the flashing blue and red lights and felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She took a deep breath and pulled over carefully, positioning her car well off the main road. "Just stay calm," she whispered to herself, placing both hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible. This wasn't her first experience with traffic stops, and she knew the drill well. Officer Keller sat in his patrol car for nearly 5 minutes before approaching. This was a tactic he often used, letting drivers stew in anxiety before he made contact. He finally stepped out, adjusting his belt and sunglasses before sauntering toward Diane's window. Diane lowered her window and looked up at Officer Keller with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, officer." Officer Keller didn't return the greeting. "License and registration?" he demanded, his tone sharp and cold. His eyes scanned the interior of her car, taking note of her neat business suit and the stack of folders on the passenger seat. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Diane asked as she reached slowly for her purse. "Broken taillight," Officer Keller replied, though Diane had just had her car serviced the previous week and was certain all lights were functioning properly. As she handed over her license and registration, Officer Keller barely glanced at them. "Where are you headed? This isn't your neighborhood, is it?" The question carried an unmistakable weight. Maple Avenue ran through one of the more affluent suburbs of the city, an area that remained predominantly white despite the diverse population of the larger metropolitan area. "I'm on my way to a meeting," Diane answered simply, maintaining her composed demeanor. Officer Keller frowned. "A meeting? At this time of day? What kind of meeting?" "A work meeting," Diane clarified, her voice still steady despite the growing tension. The officer leaned down closer to the window. "And what kind of work does someone like you do that brings you to this part of town?" A young woman walking her dog on the sidewalk slowed her pace, watching the interaction with growing concern. She pulled out her phone and began recording discreetly. "I'm an attorney," Diane said, offering no further details. Officer Keller smirked. "An attorney? Is that right?" His tone made it clear he didn't believe her. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "Officer, I don't understand. Is there a problem with my documents?" "Step out of the vehicle now," he repeated, his hand moving to rest on his holster. "I detect the smell of alcohol." This was a blatant lie. Diane hadn't had a drink in weeks, and there was no possible way he could smell alcohol from her or her car. "Officer Keller," she said, glancing at his name badge, "I have not been drinking. I'm happy to comply with reasonable requests, but I'd like to understand what's happening here." The officer's face hardened at her use of his name. "Last chance. Step out of the vehicle, or I'll remove you myself." More people had gathered now, watching from a distance as the situation escalated. Diane knew that what happened next would matter, not just for her, but for everyone watching. Diane took a deep breath, weighing her options. The growing audience of bystanders gave her both concern and comfort. Witnesses could help keep the situation from spiraling further, but she also felt the heavy weight of being publicly humiliated. "Officer, I will step out of the vehicle," she said calmly, "but I want to be clear that I'm doing so under protest. There is no legal basis for this request." Officer Keller's face tightened with anger. He wasn't used to people knowing their rights or questioning his authority, especially not people who looked like Diane. As she carefully opened her door, Diane kept her movements slow and deliberate. The afternoon sun felt suddenly hot on her skin, and she was conscious of every eye watching them. 2 more people had joined the dog walker, phones raised and recording. "Stand against the vehicle and place your hands on the hood," Officer Keller commanded, his voice louder than necessary. Diane complied but continued speaking in a level tone. "Officer, I'd like to know the specific reason for this detention. A broken taillight does not require me to exit my vehicle. You don't give the orders here," he snapped. "I already told you I smell alcohol, and now I'm detecting an attitude problem too." A middle-aged man in a business suit approached cautiously. "Is everything okay here?" he called out. "Stay back," Officer Keller shouted, his right hand moving to his holster again. This is police business. The man stopped but didn't leave. I'm just checking because this seems excessive for a traffic stop. Officer Keller pointed aggressively at the bystander. One more word, and you'll be joining her. Diane felt a mixture of gratitude and fear for the stranger's intervention. Sir, please don't put yourself at risk. I appreciate your concern. Officer Keller moved closer to Diane, speaking low enough that only she could hear. Think you're special because you have some fancy job. People like you need to learn your place. The implication in his words was unmistakable. My place, Officer Keller, is as a citizen with constitutional rights, Diane replied quietly. And those rights apply equally to everyone regardless of their appearance. This seemed to enrage him further. I'm going to search your vehicle now. I have probable cause. No, you don't, Diane stated firmly, and I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. By now, the small crowd had grown to about 8 people. Someone in the back called out, We're watching, officer. We see what you're doing. Officer Keller's radio crackled, and a voice asked if he needed backup. He grabbed the radio from his shoulder. Yeah, I got a situation here. Possible DUI. Subject is being uncooperative. Diane shook her head in disbelief. This is completely inappropriate, Officer Keller. I have not demonstrated any signs of intoxication, and you know it. Turn around, he ordered, pulling handcuffs from his belt. You're being detained while I conduct my investigation. On what grounds? Diane asked, though she already knew he had no legitimate answer. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, he warned, grabbing her wrist roughly. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around Diane's wrists as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Her briefcase still sat in her car, containing files for the meeting she was now going to miss, a meeting with the police commissioner about departmental reforms. The irony wasn't lost on her. As she stood there, professionally dressed and handcuffed beside her own car, she thought about how quickly Officer Keller had seen her skin color and made assumptions that overrode everything else about her. A police cruiser turned the corner, responding to Officer Keller's call for backup. Diane knew the next few minutes would be critical, not just for her immediate situation but for the larger issues she had been fighting to address in her work. Officer, she said quietly as the second patrol car pulled up, you've made a serious mistake today. The second patrol car pulled up alongside Officer Keller's vehicle. A younger officer stepped out, surveying the scene with obvious confusion. The growing crowd of onlookers, the well-dressed woman in handcuffs, and the palpable tension in the air clearly didn't match the routine traffic stop he had been called to assist with. What's the situation here, Keller? Asked Officer Rodriguez as he approached. Before Officer Keller could answer, a voice called out from the crowd. He's harassing her. She didn't do anything wrong. Officer Keller shot an angry glance toward the bystanders. I've got this under control. Just help me secure the scene. He turned back to Diane, gripping her arm firmly. We're going to my patrol car now. As Officer Keller led Diane away from her vehicle, she noticed several people in the crowd were now calling someone, likely reporting what they were witnessing. She maintained her composure, knowing that escalating the situation would only give Keller the excuse he seemed to be looking for. Officer Rodriguez, Diane called out, addressing the younger officer by the name on his badge. I want to formally state that I am being detained without probable cause. I was pulled over for a supposedly broken taillight, which my vehicle does not have. I have not been drinking, despite Officer Keller's claims. Rodriguez looked uncomfortably between Diane and his colleague. Keller, maybe we should. I don't need your input on how to do my job, Keller snapped. This woman has been combative and disrespectful since I pulled her over. That's simply not true, Diane countered calmly. Everything that's happened here has been recorded on multiple devices, including your own body camera. She nodded toward the small camera clipped to Officer Keller's uniform. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Keller's face. In his anger, he had forgotten about the body camera. The department had only implemented them 6 months ago, and he was still not in the habit of considering them during his interactions. My taillight is not broken, which means this stop was unlawful to begin with, Diane continued. I'd like both of you to verify that right now. Officer Rodriguez, seeming eager to defuse the situation, walked to the back of Diane's car. Both taillights are working fine, Keller, he called out after checking. That doesn't change the fact that I detected signs of intoxication, Keller insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Then I request a breathalyzer test immediately, Diane said. I have an important meeting that I'm now late for, and I'd like to resolve this situation as quickly as possible. Officer Keller hesitated. He hadn't expected this request. People who were actually intoxicated rarely volunteered for testing. Fine, he finally said. Rodriguez, get the breathalyzer from your car. As they waited, Diane stood straight despite the discomfort of the handcuffs. The crowd had grown larger, with at least 15 people now watching from the sidewalk. A news van had pulled up at the end of the block. Someone must have called the local station. You're making a spectacle of yourself, Keller muttered to Diane. I'm not the one who created this situation, officer, she replied evenly. You chose to escalate a non-existent traffic violation into a public detention. Officer Rodriguez returned with the breathalyzer. Ma'am, I'll need you to blow into this when I tell you to. Diane complied with the test, maintaining eye contact with Officer Keller as she did so. The device beeped, and Rodriguez checked the reading. It's 0.00, he announced, looking uncomfortable. There's no alcohol in her system at all. Officer Keller's face reddened. That doesn't mean she isn't on something else. Her behavior has been erratic. Everything I've done and said has been recorded, Officer Keller, Diane reminded him. I've been nothing but cooperative and calm while asserting my rights. The only erratic behavior here has been yours. A woman pushed forward from the crowd. I've been recording since you pulled her over, she called out. I've already uploaded it to social media. Everyone can see what's happening here. Officer Keller's radio crackled to life. Keller, this is Captain Bennett. What's your status on Maple Avenue? We're getting calls about a situation there. Officer Keller's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his radio. The situation was spiraling beyond his control. What had started as a routine stop, the kind he had conducted dozens of times before with no consequences, was now drawing unwanted attention. Everything is under control, Captain, he responded, trying to keep his voice steady, just dealing with an uncooperative subject. I need more details, Keller. We've got calls coming in from civilians and a news crew is reportedly on scene. Captain Bennett's voice crackled through the radio. Before Officer Keller could respond, Diane spoke up loudly enough for the radio to pick up her voice. This is Diane Washington. I've been illegally detained by Officer Keller following an unwarranted traffic stop. I'd like to speak with Captain Bennett directly. Officer Keller glared at her and moved the radio away. You don't give orders here. Keller, is that Washington? Did you say Diane Washington? Captain Bennett's voice had changed, a note of alarm replacing his usual gruff tone. Officer Rodriguez looked from the radio to Diane, his eyes widening with sudden recognition. Wait, are you State Attorney Washington? The crowd, which had been growing steadily, fell silent at these words. Officer Keller froze, his face showing the first flash of genuine uncertainty. Yes, I am, Diane confirmed calmly. And I was on my way to meet with Police Commissioner Davis about the department's community relations initiatives when Officer Keller decided to detain me without cause. Officer Keller's face drained of color. You're lying, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Keller. Captain Bennett's voice shouted through the radio. Take those cuffs off Attorney Washington immediately. Do you have any idea what you've done? As if to punctuate the captain's words, Diane's phone began ringing inside her car. The distinctive ringtone echoed in the sudden silence. That would be the commissioner, Diane said. I'm now 15 minutes late for our meeting. Would you mind getting my phone for me, Officer Rodriguez? Since I'm still handcuffed. Rodriguez moved quickly to retrieve the phone, eager to distance himself from his colleague's actions. He brought the ringing phone to Diane, holding it up so she could see the screen. The caller ID clearly displayed Commissioner Davis. Officer Keller stood paralyzed as Rodriguez awkwardly held the phone to Diane's ear. Commissioner, I apologize for missing our meeting, Diane said into the phone. I've been detained by one of your officers on Maple Avenue. Yes, that's correct. No probable cause was established. I understand. Yes, he's here now. She nodded at Rodriguez, who took the phone. This is Officer Rodriguez, sir, he said, his voice tense. Yes, sir, I understand. Right away, sir. He ended the call and immediately moved to remove Diane's handcuffs. "The commissioner is on his way here personally," he told her, avoiding Officer Keller's gaze. "He sends his deepest apologies for this incident." As the handcuffs came off, Diane rubbed her wrists and straightened her suit jacket. The crowd had grown to nearly 30 people, many recording with their phones. The news van had parked, and a reporter was preparing to broadcast live. "Officer Keller," Diane said, turning to face him directly, "I want you to understand something clearly. What happened here today is not an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern that affects countless citizens who don't have the benefit of my title to protect them." Officer Keller's radio came to life again with Captain Bennett's voice ordering him to report to headquarters immediately after the commissioner arrived. A black SUV with government plates turned the corner and sped toward them. The commissioner himself was arriving, his face visible through the windshield, tight with anger. "I believe your superior has arrived," Diane said to Officer Keller. "And I think we're about to have that meeting about police reform after all, just not quite in the way we had planned." Commissioner Davis stepped out of his SUV, his face a mask of professional control despite the anger evident in his quick movements. The crowd parted as he approached, many still recording with their phones. He was a tall man with graying hair at his temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "State Attorney Washington," he said, extending his hand to Diane. "I cannot begin to express how deeply troubling this situation is." "Commissioner," Diane acknowledged, shaking his hand firmly. "Not exactly how I planned for us to meet today." Officer Keller stood rigidly at attention, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. His eyes darted between his superior and the woman he had just handcuffed, desperately trying to formulate some explanation that might salvage his career. "Officer Keller," the commissioner said, turning to face him, "I expect a full written report on my desk within the hour. Until then, you are relieved of duty. Officer Rodriguez will drive you back to the station." "Sir, if I could explain," Keller began, but the commissioner cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Save it for your report, officer, and for the internal affairs investigation that will follow." His tone made it clear that no explanation would suffice. The news crew had set up by now, their camera trained on the scene. The reporter, a young woman in a blue blazer, approached cautiously but was held back by another officer who had arrived with the commissioner. Commissioner Davis turned back to Diane. "Attorney Washington, I'd like to speak with you privately if you're willing. My car or yours?" "Mine is fine," Diane replied, "though I believe it's still technically part of an ongoing investigation." The slight curve of her lips belied the seriousness of her words. The commissioner nodded to another officer. "Release the vehicle immediately, and ensure Attorney Washington's information is purged from any system it may have been entered into." As Officer Rodriguez led a shell-shocked Keller to his patrol car, whispers rippled through the crowd. Several people approached Diane, offering their contact information as witnesses. She accepted each one graciously, thanking them for their concern and willingness to stand by. Once seated in Diane's car, the commissioner let out a long breath. "This is exactly the kind of incident we were going to discuss today," he said, rubbing his forehead. "The irony isn't lost on me." "Nor on me," Diane replied. "But perhaps it brings a certain clarity to our conversation. This wasn't about me, Commissioner. This was about who Officer Keller thought I was based on what he saw." The commissioner nodded grimly. "His record will be thoroughly reviewed, I assure you." "That's necessary but not sufficient," Diane said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Individual accountability matters, but we need systemic change. What happened to me today happens to people across this state every day, and most don't have my resources or platform." Outside the car, the crowd was slowly dispersing. The news crew had managed to interview several witnesses, and Officer Keller was now gone, taken back to headquarters by Rodriguez. The additional patrol cars were leaving one by one, restoring the quiet to the suburban street. "The meeting we were supposed to have," Diane continued, "was about implementing body cameras and bias training across all precincts. I think today just provided us with Exhibit A for why that's urgently needed." The commissioner looked at her with newfound respect. "Most people in your position would be focused on personal retribution right now." "I'm not interested in retribution," Diane replied. "I'm interested in reform. What serves justice isn't punishing one officer, but changing a system that enabled him to act with such impunity. As they continued their impromptu meeting, Diane's phone buzzed continuously with notifications. The video of her detention was already spreading across social media, bringing public attention to an issue that had long remained in the shadows for too many. By the following morning, the video of Diane Washington's detention had spread across every major news outlet in the state. The police department's phones rang constantly, with citizens demanding answers and accountability. Inside the department headquarters, an emergency meeting had been called. Commissioner Davis sat at the head of the conference table, his face grim as he surveyed the room filled with precinct captains and administrative staff. The atmosphere was tense, with nervous glances exchanged between officers who had worked alongside Keller for years. "I don't think I need to explain the severity of what we're facing," the commissioner began, placing a tablet on the table displaying headlines about the incident. "Officer Keller's actions have put this entire department under scrutiny, but this isn't just about one officer's behavior." Captain Bennett, who had supervised Keller for the past 5 years, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Commissioner, with all due respect, Keller has been an effective officer with a solid arrest record. This incident is unfortunate, but..." "But what, Captain?" The commissioner interrupted sharply. "But it's acceptable to profile citizens, to fabricate reasons for detention, to escalate situations unnecessarily." The room fell silent. On the wall-mounted screen, Internal Affairs had pulled up Officer Keller's complete service record, including civilian complaints that had previously been dismissed without thorough investigation. 17 complaints of racial bias in the past 3 years, read the Internal Affairs Director, all marked as unfounded or insufficient evidence, despite multiple witness statements supporting the complaints. Captain Bennett stared at the floor. "We didn't have video evidence in those cases." "We didn't look for it," corrected Lieutenant Garcia from Internal Affairs. "In at least 7 of these incidents, there were security cameras in the vicinity. No one requested the footage before closing the complaints." A younger officer named Wilson, who had remained quiet until now, raised her hand hesitantly. "Sir, I've witnessed Officer Keller make inappropriate comments about minority citizens on several occasions. I didn't report it because I was told it would make me seem uncooperative." This admission opened the floodgates. Over the next hour, multiple officers came forward with accounts of problematic behavior they had observed not just from Keller, but from several other officers as well. Some spoke of an unwritten code within certain precincts. Complaints against fellow officers were viewed as betrayal, and those who reported misconduct often found themselves isolated or assigned to undesirable shifts. Commissioner Davis listened carefully to each account, taking notes without interrupting. When the last officer finished speaking, he stood up slowly. "What I'm hearing describes a culture of silence and complicity," he said. "This stops today. State Attorney Washington will be here in 30 minutes to discuss departmental reforms, and I want honest input from every person in this room." Just then, the door opened and Officer Rodriguez entered, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Sir, I've completed my report about yesterday's incident," he said, handing a folder to the commissioner. "I've also included previous instances where I observed Officer Keller conducting stops that appeared to target minority drivers, with dates and locations." The commissioner accepted the folder with a nod of appreciation. "This is exactly the kind of forthright accountability we need." As the meeting continued, officers who had remained silent for years began sharing their observations and concerns. Some admitted to witnessing problematic behavior but feeling powerless to address it. Others acknowledged their own biases and requested additional training. Outside the conference room, local community leaders gathered, having been invited by Commissioner Davis to join the second half of the meeting. Among them were civil rights activists, religious leaders, and neighborhood representatives who had long advocated for police reform. The department was facing its moment of reckoning, painful but necessary, and it had taken State Attorney Washington's experience and her courage in addressing it not as a personal grievance, but as a systemic issue, to finally break through the wall of silence. 3 days after the incident, Diane Washington stood at a podium in front of City Hall. Behind her were community leaders, reform advocates, and several police officers who had chosen to stand in solidarity with her call for change. The crowd that gathered was diverse and larger than anyone had expected, filling the plaza and spilling onto adjacent streets. What happened to me on Tuesday afternoon was not unique, Diane began, her voice clear and measured. The only unique aspect was that it happened to someone with the authority to demand accountability. Every day in our communities, citizens face similar treatment without cameras recording, without badges to protect them, and without the platform I have. News cameras captured her words as they were broadcast live across the state. Social media streams filled with comments of support, personal stories, and calls for action. I could focus today on Officer Keller and his actions, she continued. But that would miss the larger point. This isn't about one officer or one incident. This is about a system that needs fundamental change. In the front row, Maria Gonzalez nodded in agreement. She had traveled from across the city to attend after seeing the video online. 6 months earlier, her teenage son had been detained in similar circumstances, but without Diane's resources or position, the complaint she filed had disappeared into bureaucratic silence. Today, I'm announcing a 3-part initiative, Diane said. First, a comprehensive review of all civilian complaints against law enforcement in our state over the past 5 years. Second, the formation of a civilian oversight committee with real authority to investigate police misconduct. And third, a complete overhaul of training procedures with emphasis on de-escalation techniques and bias recognition. The crowd erupted in applause, but not everyone was supportive. At the edges of the gathering, a small group of counter-protesters held signs supporting Officer Keller and the police department. Some officers and their families felt the entire force was being unfairly judged based on one incident. Diane acknowledged this division directly. I want to be clear. This is not an anti-police campaign. Many officers serve with honor and integrity. In fact, several have come forward since Tuesday to report problematic behavior they've witnessed, but felt unable to address due to departmental culture. She gestured to the officers standing behind her. Officer Rodriguez was among them, having made the difficult decision to publicly support reform despite pressure from some colleagues to remain silent. After her speech, Diane moved through the crowd, speaking with citizens who shared their own experiences. An elderly man gripped her hand with tears in his eyes, thanking her for giving voice to concerns he had carried for decades. A young mother introduced her son, explaining how she had to teach him different rules for interacting with police than his white friends learned. Across town at a local diner, Officer Keller sat alone watching the broadcast on a wall-mounted television. He had been suspended pending the investigation, his service weapon and badge temporarily surrendered. As he listened to Diane speak, his initial anger had given way to a defensive righteousness, then to uncomfortable reflection. "She's throwing us all under the bus," commented another customer at the counter. Keller didn't respond. For the first time, he was seeing the story through eyes other than his own. The video of the incident had been played countless times, and with each viewing, his actions became harder to justify even to himself. By evening, community dialogues were happening across the city. In church basements, community centers, and living rooms, people gathered to share stories and discuss solutions. Some of these conversations were difficult and uncomfortable, but they were happening openly for the first time in years. Commissioner Davis, who had initially feared the incident would destroy public trust in his department, was finding instead that transparency was building a foundation for something stronger. The same day, he announced that all officers would wear body cameras effective immediately, and footage would be accessible through a civilian review process. What had begun as one officer's misuse of authority was catalyzing a movement for accountability that had been building beneath the surface for years. 6 months after the incident on Maple Avenue, State Attorney Diane Washington stood in the training hall of the newly renovated police academy. The room was filled with fresh recruits and veteran officers alike, all gathered for the inaugural session of the department's transformed training program. "When I was handcuffed on the side of the road half a year ago," Diane began, "I couldn't have imagined that moment would lead to what we see today." The changes were visible throughout the department. Body cameras were now standard equipment for every officer. Complaint forms were available in multiple languages and could be submitted online, by phone, or in person at community centers separate from police stations. Most significantly, a civilian oversight board with real authority had been established, with members elected from neighborhoods across the city. "Officer Keller is no longer with the department," Diane continued, acknowledging the elephant in the room. The review of his record revealed a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. But removing one officer was never the goal. Changing the system that enabled that behavior was. In the back of the room sat former Officer Keller himself. After his dismissal, he had gone through a period of anger and denial before eventually accepting responsibility for his actions. Today he was here not as an officer but as part of the training program, a living example of how unchecked bias could derail a career and harm a community. Some of you might wonder why I invited James Keller to be here today, Diane said, acknowledging his presence. It's because real change requires honest reflection from all sides. Keller stood up when called upon. The confidence he once projected was gone, replaced by a humbler demeanor. What I did that day came from biases I didn't even recognize I had, he told the room. I saw Ms. Washington's race before I saw her as a person. I made assumptions that had no basis in reality, and I abused my authority because I could. His candor was part of a healing process that extended beyond the department. Across the city, community relations with police were improving slowly but steadily. Crime reporting had increased in neighborhoods where residents had previously mistrusted authorities. Officer recruitment from minority communities had risen by 30%. Captain Bennett, who had initially defended Keller, now led the department's accountability division. His first-hand experience with how oversight failures enabled misconduct made him unexpectedly effective in his new role. The easiest thing would have been to simply punish Officer Keller and move on, Diane continued. But easy solutions rarely address root problems. What we built instead is a framework for ongoing improvement and accountability. Officer Rodriguez, recently promoted to sergeant, supervised a group of new recruits. His decision to speak out against misconduct had initially made him an outcast among some colleagues. Now, he was respected as someone with the courage to uphold the true meaning of the badge. After the formal presentation, Diane walked through the training facility, observing the new curriculum in action. In one room, officers practiced de-escalation techniques with community volunteers. In another, they participated in virtual reality scenarios designed to help them recognize and counteract implicit bias in their decision-making. As she prepared to leave, Maria Gonzalez, the mother who had attended her speech months earlier, approached her. Maria was now an instructor in the community engagement program. My son still gets nervous when he sees police cars, Maria told Diane. But last week an officer stopped to help when his bike chain broke. They ended up talking for 20 minutes. Small steps, but important ones. Diane nodded in agreement. The work isn't finished, she said. It may never be fully finished, but for the first time, I believe we're genuinely moving forward. Outside the academy, a new billboard displayed the department's revised mission statement, to protect and serve, with equity and respect for all. Below it, in smaller text, was a quote from Diane Washington. Justice isn't just what happens in courtrooms. It's what happens on our streets every day. The incident that had begun as a personal humiliation for Diane had transformed into an institutional change that would affect thousands of lives for years to come.